call. Now we have David Ponsa. David Ponsa is the Director of North America from Vortex, and he is an expert in renewables with more than 20 years of international experience in business development. So take it away, David.
Hi, thank you, Christina, for your introduction, and thanks to the AWEA for inviting Vortex to participate in this event. Next slide, please. So my presentation today will be about the Alias validation at 18 offshore sites around the world. But first, I would have to explain what Alias is all about and previously give some clues about modeled data and why this is used in the wind industry. Next slide. A few slides about Vortex for those of you that do not know much about us. We're a small company that has been in the wind industry since 2005, established in Barcelona by former wind engineers with a long track record, wind resource assessment at some of the biggest OEMs. We're a private-owned company, so we do not depend on third parties such as investment funds. And then all decisions are taken at our headquarters in Barcelona. This is important that we are not consultants. We do not do any site assessment or similar. We just supply modeled wind data to our customers. Some of them are consultants, but any site of the world, both onshore and offshore. We don't sell any software, license, trainings. And in fact, all our data can be used as input data for most of the common softwares out there, such as OpenWind, WindPro, and WindSim. And we proudly say that we were pioneers since 2016 in the wind industry for the commercial application of the LES, which so far we have been launching about 1,200 runs. Next slide, please. Then the best way to estimate the wind resource in a site is having real measurements. There's no doubt about that, but some limitations show up about the quality of the data, how many master lidars are used, and for how long measurements are taken. Next slide, please. So the quality of the data or having 10 minutes data should not be a problem. You just need to have couple pneumometers, wind vanes that will have to be recalibrated periodically. And I'm not that sure if this happens, but anyway, this is not the discussion today. But the first limitation might be on how many masts or lidars are used. And ideally, this should be as many as possible, but you end up having just one or two since they are not cheap devices, as you can see in these figures that Crystal from DNVGL, which I have to say thanks, presented this a couple of weeks ago at another AWEA event. And about measuring at different heights, again, this should be as many as possible to estimate the wind vertical profile, but you normally have 2 or 3 in onshore masts and maybe a few more in offshore. And the other thing is how long measurements are taken. And although 20, 30 years would be ideal, this is not realistic, and you end up, again, having just 1 year or even less than that. It is also important to decide where to install master lidars, especially in large areas where a high investment could easily turn into a high expense if measurements conclude that the wind is not good enough. Next slide, please. And other issues could be, for example, data gaps due to the sensor stopped working, icing conditions, or a lack of communication with the data logger. Next. Then the atmosphere modeling can help somehow to solve some of these limitations, but this is not an easy thing to deal with, since the atmosphere is described by a bunch of non-linear equations that are not easy to solve. Then you need to be really skilled in numerical modeling and do the right settings in the right software so the model gets as close as possible to reality. Next. And there are different atmosphere modeling strategies are used depending on the time and length scales. So this can go from the climate scale, which is hundreds of years and 100,000 kilometers, down to small eddies, which are a few minutes and a few meters, as you can see in these leaves swirling in the left-hand side. And the typical extensions of wind farms, which are a few kilometers, make the wind industry focus on mesoscale and microscale models, which are a few hours and a few kilometers for mesoscale, and 10-minute data and a few hundred meters for microscale. Next, please. One important thing to be aware of is that all these models are somehow linked to each other, and you can see there are common areas where more than one model can be used, and each model is fed by data from the previous one. So, for example, the mesoscale model uses the global model data to start up. Next slide. And then the global data is what is known as reanalysis. And essentially, this is a bunch of meteorological data, which is temperature, wind speed, pressure, collected every day at all over the world, airports and harbors, weather stations, satellites. But it is a very computational, consumption demanding, and requires a huge storage capacity for the data, which makes it almost impossible for private companies. So only big international institutions like these ones here from US and Europe basically can afford that. And the problem for the wind industry is that the resolution of the reanalysis data is around 30 to 50 kilometers, which is too low to take decisions about where to install the wind turbines, what type of turbines, rotor diameter, hub height, megawatt. And in a reanalysis data grid, in a cell, let's say, of 30 by 30 kilometers, all data looks the same inside this cell. So it means the same temperature, same air density, same wind speed. And this is far from reality, where we can easily see trees, cliffs, and buildings all around. So we need to downscale this low resolution data to a higher one. Next slide, please. And the way to deal with atmosphere modeling is by using the numerical weather prediction softwares that can solve those nonlinear equations that I mentioned before. Looking either to the future, we can see daily on weather forecasts on TV, or looking backwards and telling us how the wind had blown in the site over the last 20, 30 years. And the wind industry so far assumes that the wind will blow the same for the next 20 to 30 years. But this is climate change permitting, which will lead to another discussion, not the one today. And a very common software is the WRF, the Weather Research and Forecasting by the NCAR, which is an open source. It's used by a large community of developers that can contribute and improve algorithms and stuff. Next slide, please. And WRF is fed by topography, land cover, and the reanalysis data sets. And in this example, somewhere in Texas, if we try to decide where to install this turbine at 25 kilometers resolution, we might have problems to identify a good spot. We could think somewhere in the middle of the yellow area where wind speed is around 7 meters per second, but if we downscale to 9 kilometers resolution, next slide, then we might think about moving southeast, still around 7 meters per second wind speed. If we go further down to 3 kilometers resolution, next, things start getting clear. Then we can go a bit further southeast where higher wind speeds show up, around 8.5 meters per second. And if we finally increase the resolution to 1 kilometer, next slide, please, then we would end up moving the turbine a bit up north, where we clearly see that the best wind resource around 9 meters per second. And higher resolution will enter into the microscale modeling, and this leads us to talk about the AWEA. Next slide. To make it simple, the Vortex LES is 1 year of 10 minutes time series at 100 meters horizontal resolution, where data is computed and saved at 4 Hz, which means 4 samples each second. And at a price around a few $1,000s, okay? We could complicate things a little bit by saying that WRF-LES is a powerful tool which is based on coupling the WRF model. Remember, this is mesoscale. There's an error in this slide. It should read mesoscale, not macroscale, so sorry about that. With LES, which stands for Large Eddy Simulations, the microscale model that uses a CFD algorithm to solve the turbulent eddies. The main difference between the WRF and WRF-LES is that the first one does not solve the turbulent eddies, it just parameterizes them. The next slide. So let's imagine MetMast, a real one, 100 meters height, next one. And this would be an LES virtual MetMast, the same 100 meters, the same measurement heights, and outputting the same data at each level, which can help to estimate, for example, the turbulence intensity, wind shear, and inflow angle. Next slide. But this virtual MetMast can go further up to 400 meters, covering all rotor swept area, which is useful to estimate the rotor equivalent wind speed as per the IEC standard issued in 2017. And if a particular height is needed, for example, or a hub height of a specific turbine, it's 145.5 meters. This is also possible with LES. Next slide. And this is essentially how the Vortex LES data looks like. As you can see, this is the closest thing to real measurements. This example is computed 80 meters height. The same or almost the same data that you will pull out from a data logger. Next slide. And by using LES, you can fill gaps at real measurements like I explained before, right? Next slide. If you have an offshore wind farm with a met mast or a LiDAR, next slide, you could get an LES at the same position and establish some kind of like transfer function, next, and then extrapolate to all operating turbines, next. So this would end up like having a virtual met mast at each turbine position, which could help to identify potential turbulence issues. This would be like having turbulence intensity and inflow angle information at each turbine, which would be really useful for load assessment. Next. Which is exactly what the Vortex presented at the AWEA Wind Resource Workshop in Seattle last year, combining remote sensing devices, LiDAR, with traditional met mast and model data. In this case, it was Vortex LES. And some of you may know there are two parameters that have a major impact on turbine loads, the environmental ones and those associated with the turbine operation. And Vortex work was focused on turbulence intensity and wind shear. They analyzed the remaining operational life of all turbines to establish a lifetime extension strategies, which has been discussed at the main operation and maintenance conferences in Europe over the last 5 years. And this is because a significant number of operating turbines in there are getting close to the 20 years they were designed for. The point is about either going towards repowering or lifetime extension strategies. Next slide. And as you can see here, for example, for the wind shear, next slide, or for the turbulence intensity, real and model data are pretty close to each other. And next slide. Anyway, the conclusions are quite clear. So a combination of remote sensing devices and LES modeling lead to an improvement in site condition assessment and to a reduction in risk and uncertainties about turbine loads. And at the end of the day, this means better lifetime extension strategies, and last but not least, LiDAR and LES complement each other. They do not compete. There is room for both technologies in the wind industry. This is an important message to take. Next slide. And finally, we can come to the Alias offshore validation exercise, which is available at Vortex webpage. Next slide. These are the 18 sites, some in Europe, which this is where the offshore wind technology started many years ago, US, China. And as you can see, we could only validate standard deviation and turbulence intensity at 5 of these sites because this data was not available at the other 13, where we could only validate wind speed. Okay, next slide. And we focused our validation in 3 of the main parameters used in the wind industry, which are the wind speed, standard deviation, and turbulence intensity. And for the wind speed, we used as metrics the mean bias, the mean absolute error, and the mean correlation at different time scales from 10 minutes to monthly. And as you can clearly see, there's a very good matching between real data and model 1. For example, the mean absolute error is just around 3%, with a slightly tendency to underestimate the research, where the mean bias, as you can see again, is minus 1.31%. And the correlation is a really good one. For monthly, it's almost 1, it's 0.98, and even for the 10 minutes, it's a pretty good figure. The mean bias for the 5 sites where standard deviation was validated, it is around 0.3%, which is pretty good, I guess. And for turbulence intensity, the error is a combination of the wind speed and standard deviations. And as you can see in this plot, Results again are pretty good. Then to characterize the turbulence at a site using the curve defined by the IAC, we calculated the mean absolute error weighted by Weibull, which was 0.8% and was 1.9% for the 15 meters per second bit. Next slide. And as a conclusions, 4 ideas to take home with. This is Vortex LES. It's a 1 year, 10 minutes time series at 100 meters horizontal resolution that can complement measurements. So filling data gaps, for example, from LiDARs or MedMast. And then at early stages of a wind farm development, LES is like a virtual MedMast. Could be one or more than one, since the price is really competitive. Just a few $1,000s at any height, covering all rotor diameter. And for the operation phase of wind farm development, the LES can help to identify potential turbine underperformances due to turbulence and also give us useful information for load assessment and lifetime extension like Nordex Acciona came up with. And most important, there is a high correlation between measurements and model data at the 18 offshore sites validated with a slight underestimation of wind speed. And last slide, please. Just saying thanks for your attention. And this is a very nice site, as you can see here, which is not far from Barcelona, but there's too much wind for having an offshore wind farm, very strong and gusted wind. But this is a nice place to go hiking, swimming, or kayaking if you ever have the opportunity to go there. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And up next, we have Lindsey Sheridan.